Welcome, everyone. Well, thanks so much for coming this morning. It's great to see a full theater and to see all of you here. I know you're all here to see the Pompeii exhibition and to hear our speakers, so I won't take long. But I'm Mark Engstrom, and I'm the interim director and CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum. And I wanted to come by personally to thank you for coming and tell you how much you mean to us as members, as special friends of the ROM. I know you're going to enjoy the exhibit. It's, I'm biased, but I think it's the best exhibit we've done yet in our blockbuster space in the Crystal building. I think it's the content is fantastic. It involves both culture and natural history because we're talking both about the volcano and the results of the volcano and the civilization that it preserved once we had the eruption. I think we're also trying to do some special things. If you want to come back tonight, for the whole week, we've been broadcasting on the outside of the building and using the crystals as a canvas. We've been broadcasting Mount Vesuvius, and Mount Vesuvius is becoming angrier and angrier as the week has gone on. And tonight it's going to culminate in an eruption, complete with perhaps with lightning, if the weather cooperates. But it will there'll certainly be some fireworks involved. So you might want to come by and see it tonight with our Friday Night Live program. So again, I think you'll judge the exhibit for yourself when you go see it. But I'm very proud of it, and I'm proud of the people from the ROM who have worked on it to create, I think, what is the best Pompeii exhibition I've ever seen. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sasha Priva, who is our managing director for World Cultures, to introduce our speakers. Sasha.
Good morning, everyone. Huge thank you also from me for coming out and for your continued support for the ROM. I also hope you're going to enjoy the show. We think it's a blast and hope you will concur. This exhibition is indeed a ROM original featuring 200 objects from Pompeii. You will be able to immerse yourself in the public and daily life of the Roman Empire and get face to face with the Romans. No longer are they distant and grand figures or the typical Romans of popular imagination, such as the emperors and gladiators, although they do have a role to play in the exhibition. You will come up close and personal with real people. I welcome you to join us to get an extraordinary look at an ordinary town that perished 1,936 years ago. I would like to also thank our exhibit partners, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the Superintendents for Archaeological Heritage of Naples, the Archaeological Depositories of Pompeii, Herculaneum and Stabia, the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Tourism, the Consulate General of Italy in Toronto, the Embassy of Italy in Ottawa, and of course the Government of Canada and the Embassy of Canada in Rome. I'd also like to thank our generous exhibit patrons, Moira and Alfredo Romano, Air Canada Cargo, and our media sponsors, the Toronto Star and CTV. Special thanks also to our programming partners, the Italian Contemporary Film Festival and the Italian Cultural Institute Toronto. So watch out for what the program is well. Yes, we have some spectacular things lined up for you. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers, Katherine Dunnell and Paul Denis. Katherine Dunnell, who will go first, is the ROM's resident volcanologist and is a member of the Pompeii curatorial team. She's the mineralogy technician in the Department of Natural History. And she joined the ROM in 1997, since then has participated in several exhibitions, many with a focus on a passion which is gems and jewelry. And actually there's plenty of bling in the show. And she was also a member of the teams that developed the ROM's tech suite of galleries, Earth Treasures, in 2008, and the Barrick Gold Corporation Gallery in 2014. She holds a BA in Physical Geography and a BSc in Geology and Geochemistry from the University of Waterloo. Paul Denis is the assistant curator of the Greek, Etruscan, Roman, and Byzantine collection, basically the man of the Mediterranean at the ROM. He's the lead curator of the Pompeii exhibit and has worked here since 1981. And one of his key focuses has been to enhance the collection with some key and strategic acquisitions. He was the lead curator of the development of numerous permanent galleries dedicated to the civilizations of the Mediterranean in 2005 and 2011. You can see all of those, of course, on the third floor, and I'm sure you're very familiar with them. And he's also the curator of numerous exhibitions and preceding Pompeii. The most recent one was Fakes and Forgeries in 2010. Before I welcome our speakers, I would like to hold this little vignette up, which you can also pick up when you exit later. Please share your experience with us when you go through the exhibition, photographs and videos permitted. On Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, do your own Periscope live video feed if you like. We're trialing this new app and it's actually picking up some steam. And the hashtag is ROMMembers. But now I would like to welcome your speakers, Katherine, Dunnell, and Paul Denis.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a full audience today and on a gloomy day. 2 years ago, we started this exhibit, so we're excited for it to get on the floor. We're excited that people are excited about it, and I'm excited that you're all here today. Of course, Paul and Kate and I have worked as part of the curatorial team on Pompeii, and we've spent a lot of time together in the last 2 years. So I'm going to talk briefly about the volcano, and then Paul is going to fill in sort of the cultural side and the archaeological side of the exhibition. So we started off with a bunch of market surveying at the very beginning, and we wanted people to really understand where we were talking about and why it was important and why this is such a fantastic archaeological site. Paul has said in other talks and when we were on the team that, this was really just a very minor Roman town that became great because it's basically now a time capsule of how people were living the day before or the day of the eruption. And I started to really ruminate on that, and I thought, Mount Vesuvius is really just a very ordinary volcano. In terms of a geologic or geoscience perspective, we have ratings for volcanoes and how explosive or sort of how angry they are, and it's called a VIC index. And I looked up Mount Vesuvius and this eruption, and it came out to have a VIC index of 5, which if you went to school, that's 63%, which is a very average mark for a volcano. And again, I started to think, we have an average Roman town, we have an average volcano, and the combination of the two made something absolutely spectacular. We're going to talk very briefly about the volcano and what volcanoes do and where they form. Part of our market testing showed that people didn't understand the nature and why things sort of happen. Why we don't have volcanoes in Ontario was one of the things that was asked, and people couldn't tell me why. So what's interesting is the word volcano is actually from the word Vulcan, which is the Roman word for god of fire and metalwork. So it's kind of apropos. And what they believed was Vulcan worked deep in a mountain called Volcano, located off the island of Italy. And when he worked, it caused these volcanic eruptions. When Vulcan was angry, major eruptions occurred. What we know from a scientific perspective about volcanoes is volcanoes are really just vents that allow magma, which is sort of molten rock, to come from at depth to surface. So it could be anywhere. It could be a fissure, it could be a crack, it could be a very large mountain. While many people associate these kind of cone-shaped mountains as volcanoes, any hole that lava extrudes from is considered a volcano. So as we look at this map of the globe, we understand that there seems to be a pattern. That volcanoes are just not, and earthquakes are just not random events on our planet. So this is the 1,500 active volcanoes on our Earth's surface at this moment. And there's 10,000 active vents on the seafloor. So the mid-oceanic ridges here are where our Earth is actually forming. And these areas along what we call, this is called the Pacific Rim of Fire for a reason, is where a lot of these plates subduct under continental crust. So as we look at this, we understand that actually volcanoes are not random. They just don't pop up places. They're always associated with plate tectonics. And volcanoes have a really important role in how our Earth works. They basically have formed about 80% of our crust. So where we live and where we travel to is because of a volcano. Ocean floor vents, Hawaiian hotspot volcanoes, Rift Valley volcanoes are all examples of types of volcanoes that are found at different places along these margins. And how they formed and where they formed obviously also sort of dictates how they erupt. So this is a perfect example. Sasha, who introduced me, we were walking through the shops at the end of Pompeii, and there's obviously a kids section. And there's a great cross-section of what we consider a stratovolcano, which is the one on the right. You're right. And then there's another T-shirt with this erupting volcano, almost I think this image on the left. And Sasha, who's in world cultures, is world cultures based, said to me, he goes, "Oh, look, there's a volcano T-shirt." He goes, "But that's not the right type of volcano." And I felt like, oh, validation. He said, "Your work here is done." And I thought, yes, my work here is done. Different volcanoes forming in different types of geologic settings erupt differently. That is one of the basic key concepts that you need to understand, that we want you to understand when you go through the exhibition. We associate ourselves with these lovely, lovely, fiery Hawaiian volcanoes that just ooze out all of this very thin lava that kind of drips into a blue ocean. This is not the circumstance that happened with Mount Vesuvius, and these are not the types of volcanoes that are associated in Italy. This is sort of a close-up. So the area that we're talking about is right here. And as you can see, it looks a little messy. So these yellow lines are actually plate margins. And as we get closer, we understand things get a little messier. This is the European plate. This is the African plate. This is the Arabian plate. This is a part of sort of a failed rift arm that's coming up from Africa. And then you have all of these little Anatolian and Aegean plates in here. There's Italy right here. So what's happening essentially is Africa's moving up and subducting under Europe. And all of this tectonic activity in Italy is a result of that in a very broad sense. I had a lot of questions about volcanism in Greece and how it's related. We can see the cause is the same. Africa is still pushing up north, but the plate is different. It's not the European plate, it's the Aegean plate. That's actually a lot of the volcanoes in Greece, where they're located. This is the messy one, which we're not gonna ever get into other than with you guys. And you will not see it in the exhibition. We want plate margins to be really clean. When you start looking at these plates, you understand that there's a lot of wonkiness happening, and I'm not sure how Italy managed to survive. But there's the African plate. Sicily is down here. This is actually a really interesting geologic area, Sicily. We know, Mount Etna is very active still. And in 2011, geologists figured out there's actually all of this that's happening there's Switzerland and the Alps up here, which is one of the reasons why the Alps was formed, because Africa is pushing. There's a new subduction zone opening down here, which is crazy. This is $30 million years of geology always working one way, and things are changing. So this area will always be active. This area will always have earthquakes, and this area will always have volcanoes. So this is the unmessy version, which you'll see down in the exhibition. You note that all of these volcanoes look very patterned. Things are not random. They always form along a plate margin. Not so messy. Mount Vesuvius is part of a chain of volcanoes called the Campania Arch, which stretches along the coast of Italy. What is happening to produce this? We did strive for people to understand that in the exhibition that volcanic activity is directly related to what is happening under our feet with plate tectonics. The other key thing to remember when we go through the exhibition is that plate movement is continuous. It's moving right now. And Mount Vesuvius is active and is still active. People talk about dormancy of volcanoes. I think and there's a lot of controversy in geology about dormancy. These are deemed dormant. I don't necessarily believe that. They're just sleeping. It might be without our context, but the cycle of some of these erupting might be 1,000 years, which is sort of outside of our human experience. So now we know why volcanoes form where they form, and we're looking specifically at our friend Mount Vesuvius. You'll notice the morphology of Mount Vesuvius is weird. It's got kind of a humpback. Boop, boop. What's happening? This is actually Mount Vesuvius, which is this side, is actually a younger version that was born out of a larger volcano called Mount Soma. So it's a twofer. This is the ancient volcano. This is the active one today. It's about 1,281 meters high. And it's what we consider a composite or stratovolcano, very high-sided, very conical-looking volcano. What comes out of these volcanoes is a magma that's very gooey, very silicious, called an andesitic or rhyolitic volcano. This is why things get really crazy. Within our experience, Mount St. Helens was also this type of volcano. These volcanoes, as magma comes up, they solidify and crystallize, creating plugs, which creates pressure. These lavas or these magmas have a huge amount of dissolved gases in them. So it's almost like getting a bottle of Coke and shaking it. What comes out of the top of them is similar to what happens in these types of volcanoes. This is important in terms of the context of the exhibition, in that people weren't running away from lava. They were walking around for hours after this started to erupt and sort of dodging hail-sized pieces of ash and lapilli or pumice from the sky. And then, of course, probably not made the right choice, but we know how that works. So today, this morning, I'm at my desk about an hour ago, and there's 2 monitoring sites at Mount Vesuvius and they're measuring this sort of the earth shake. It's still active. It's been misbehaving since about 1999, and this was within the last 2 hours. Our microsite, if you're interested in what's happening with Mount Vesuvius, you can click to the raw microsite and have a look, because it's always burping or doing something, which is good. Because these little microbursts of pressure release pressure so you don't get a buildup, which can be, over time, catastrophic. So the day of the disaster, what we really found, and what's remarkable about the exhibit, is that a lot of the objects, which Paul will talk about, feel like they have been used yesterday. They're gorgeous, they're relevant, they're things that we use today. These people lived like us in a lot of ways. What's also interesting in the comparison is we've just seen a very large volcano erupt in Chile in the last 2 months. A very similar type of volcano to Mount Vesuvius. So the parallels are, how do these people live? They live like us, we identify with them. Why didn't some of them leave and why did some of them stay? I think a lot of the misnomers around the bad guy of the volcano was when we really started to break down the day of disaster, there was opportunity for people to leave, and they did. I think there's a lot of urban myth around who left, who didn't, and how catastrophic it was. Not that loss of life is not catastrophic, but we broke down the day into 3 distinctive phases. Phase 1 was just every day. It was just after lunch in the Mediterranean, Everyone was having a bit of a siesta after having a nice lunch, and the sky started to get dark. It started to get dark because the volcano started to extrude some ash into the air. It's pretty hard to understand the population of Pompeii at this time because there had been a major earthquake about 10 years previously, so not everyone was back and living in Pompeii. I think the estimates were around 14,000 or 20,000 people lived in Pompeii at one time. And from some of the papers, they think, and this is an estimation, about 75 to 92% of the people left when it started to get dark. So it's not everyone. I think that number will change when or if they start excavating the whole site. Because I have a feeling, in my personal experience, if things were happening and I wanted to get out, I would head to the harbor to figure out, and that part of the archaeological site hasn't been excavated. I have a feeling human nature told people to get out by ship, and that was not happening either. This is what we call a Plinian eruption. This gas cloud that got shoved into the atmosphere is about 30 kilometers high. So the power of the force of what's happening and the pressure that's happening with Mount Vesuvius is tremendous. We see this a lot with volcanoes today. Mount Pinatubo is a great example. If anyone remembers when Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, we had the worst summer and the rainiest summer on record. And it was because when you throw up this much ash into the atmosphere, it affects everyone globally. You get friction, you get lightning, and you get rain. And what's more devastating for people, especially in places like Chile, which we just saw erupt, is there's a lot of ash on the ground, and then a lot of torrential rain, and then they get mudslides, which actually can cause more loss of life. So this is not a great circumstance. So this is happening, and people hung out. And I'm not sure why, because I would be out of there. But this cauliflower-shaped cloud is called a Plinian eruption, and it's named after Pliny and a diagnostic of Mount Vesuvius, of this eruption specifically. This is what was coming out of the volcano. Again, if this was bonking me on the head, I would be so far gone. So these are bombs, and this is sort of the size that we're dealing with. It's the pilly size, so it's the size of a loonie, and they were falling and raining down on people in Pompeii. But there's accounts where people were walking around, still going to the market. Some people had pillows on their heads, and they're going about their daily lives. Some people obviously left. There is a couple papers that geoscientists did that actually did the stratigraphic column of how thick these sequences were. And they sort of linked them up to sort of the time frame of how this eruption occurred. And they think that this accumulation was about 15 centimeters an hour. So for us, I think about snow at 15 centimeters an hour. About hour 6 after continuous sort of accumulation, we see structural integrity, and we see a lot of people dying inside their homes because the load of that much rock and on roofs and things started to create collapse. This is sort of what we call the phase 1. Phase 1 was people were inside, kind of hunkering in, moving furniture around, trying to protect things, and their roofs started to collapse. About 394 people died, and majority of them were found indoors. So Pompeii got the brunt of a lot of this because they were downwind. So the prevailing wind threw most of the ash and debris towards them. So the next morning, early the next morning, right before sunrise, this is from Japan, but this is sort of the extent of what we're dealing with pyroclastic surges. Phase 2. If you didn't get crushed, you got swept up in one of these. This is what we call a pyroclastic surge or pyroclastic flow. And what ends up happening is the eruption at some point peaked, so the energy dissipated. And when you have 30 kilometers of ash thrown up into the sky and someone turns off the hot air, what happens? It all falls, and it falls fast, and it falls almost like a wave, like we know water, and it rolls. And it basically, this is what a pyroclastic surge is. Within the walls of Pompeii, they noted about 7 pyroclastic surges, one after the other, after the other. When you go outside the city, there were more, so I think some of them didn't breach the wall. But if you survived the first phase of this eruption, you certainly didn't survive the second. The remaining 650 bodies were found outside of shelters or structures, and they were in this sort of phase or layers within inside the city. These are hot, but not hot. So it's interesting what you research when you have to do an exhibition. What's the temperature of people succumbing to heat? You type that in. What's the cremation temperature? You know, sort of getting an idea, because these pyroclastic surges can be super hot depending how close you are to them, or or not very hot. What you'll see in the exhibition is a lot of the casts are still wearing clothes. So cotton and wool combust at about 500 degrees Celsius. People succumb to thermal shock over 220. And so this puts us in around a 300 centigrade range for these things. So these, as they came down, hit people with heat and they died, thankfully. They didn't asphyxiate, they died from thermal shock and then were buried. What the ash did was actually create an anoxic environment without oxygen. So these things could, as it lithified and compacted, these people were still there, creating and then slowly decomposing, creating the voids in which we now have the casts, right? Kind of morbid, but really cool. My mentor used to say, the death and destruction factor of geology is the coolest part. It is, and it's not. At the end of it all, Pompeii was buried by 5 meters of volcanic material. And when you go down to the exhibition, what's really spooky is our exhibition hall is 5 meters tall. So if you're standing in there to get a sense of how much column of ash was happening or how much debris, if you stand there and look up, you'll understand that there was a tremendous volume of stuff coming out of Mount Vesuvius. Their bodies were contorted by the heat, but not hot enough to incinerate some of the clothes, which you'll see on some of the bodies, which is, I think, super cool. But today, we see Vesuvius as a creator still. It creates crust, it creates fertile soil. It's created this remarkable archaeological site from something that was very mediocre to something that's extraordinary. And people are still living there. 3.5 million people live in this area of around this volcano and live every day knowing that, you know what, it's due. The cycle of Mount Vesuvius is 50 years, and the last time it erupted was 1944. So, as we know, geology always wins because plate tectonics are always happening. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you for coming to the museum today. It is a great pleasure for me to present this lecture on Pompeii to the members of the ROM. I thank you very much for your support of the museum. I'd especially like to be thankful to the government of Italy, the superintendents for the archaeological heritage of Naples and the archaeological depositories of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabia for loaning the ROM the 200 fabulous objects you will be seeing and enjoying in just a few moments. Their extraordinary generosity is evident throughout the exhibition. As Katherine has just set the stage, Pompeii was buried beneath 5 meters of ash and pumice and rocks. For more than 1,600 years, the ancient city of Pompeii remained buried, practically undisturbed except for the occasional treasure hunter. Large-scale exploration began in 1748, funded by the Bourbon kings of Naples. This haphazard digging unearthed large areas of the ancient city. A more systematic approach to archaeological excavation started in 1863, directed by Giuseppe Fiorelli, one of the first people to excavate layer by layer stratigraphy and make detailed records. Amedeo Maiuri was the director of the excavations between 1924 and 61. After 1945, after the Second World War, Maiuri resumed large-scale excavations at an unprecedented scale and pace. Uncovering the site took priority over documentation and restoration. About 60% of Pompeii was uncovered, while about 40% of it today remains unexcavated. Since 1995 to present, the emphasis has now been placed on recording, consolidating, and conserving the structures that have already been exposed rather than large-scale excavations. So the Italians right now are sort of running to just stay where they are. And now I'd like to give you a preview of the exhibition and show you some of the wonderful works of art and interesting archaeological artifacts that await you. There are 6 main themes in the exhibition. So right now I'll only show you a selection of objects from 3 of the sections. They are the public life, private life, and the human toll. So here's one of the first objects you'll encounter. It's a life-size marble portrait of a standing boy, young man, and he's wearing a toga, and the toga at that time was the official sort of uniform of a Roman citizen, a male Roman citizen. And we can tell exactly what kind of toga he's wearing. There were different types of toga. When you look at his chest, right here, you can see he's wearing a bulla. Right here, there's a bulla. And a bulla was a talisman or an amulet worn by youths until they reached manhood. And so we know he's a youth, and so he'd be wearing a toga praetexta, which had a purple border. This is one of my favorite objects in the exhibition. It's a stunning portrait of a Julio-Claudian princess, and the workmanship on her hair is just exquisite. The use of the chisel is very thick and very curly as it falls down the sides of her head and the back. She's also wearing this interesting diadem, a beaten real diadem, and it's tied around and then tied at the back of her head with fillets. She dates from the time of Nero. You can tell that by the thick hairstyle, so it would date to about 50 to 68 AD. And here's an interesting fresco, and it shows, you'd think it was a bakery, a man selling bread, but it's not. It's called distribution of the bread, and the man sitting behind the counter in the white toga, and there's stacks of bread around him. Actually, he's giving out the bread for free. He's a politician running for office. So nothing's changed, really. And so he's handing out free bread to the 3 people in front. And then after the election, if he wins, he's back there handing out free bread, thanking them. And so then there's an actual piece of carbonized bread in the exhibition. Just before the eruption, there were a number of bread was the sort of the staple of Pompeians, and so there were about 30 bakeries throughout the city. And on one of them, the house of the baker, we found about, I think it was 30 or 40 of these loaves of bread that were still in the oven as before he fled. They were still baking, and they carbonized because of the eruption, the heat of the volcano, the pyroclastic flows. Then another part of the exhibition, civic religion. This is public religion. I'll just show you one of the goddesses. This is Venus. Venus was the patron goddess of the city of Pompeii. And then also, there were mystery cults throughout the Roman Empire. And in Pompeii, there was a temple dedicated to the mystery cult of Isis. And this is a statue of Isis, a beautiful statue found in the temple of Isis. And Isis promised, the cult of Isis was very popular because Isis promised an afterlife. And this is an exquisite statue, especially the detailing, the chiseling of her hair, and then her face, and then the drapery of her body, covering her body. And the Romans loved mass spectator sports just like we do today. And so in the amphitheater, where these spectacles were held, there were gladiatorial fights and fights against animals. And this helmet you're looking at, bronze helmet, gladiator helmet, was found in the barracks of the gladiator. And so the amphitheater where the fights took place, the games took place, could hold 20,000 people, but Pompeii, the population was around 12,000. And so Pompeii was considered sort of an entertainment center, an entertainment capital for the area around the hinterland, just around surrounding Pompeii. And the amphitheater in Pompeii is the oldest surviving securely dated stone amphitheater in the Roman Empire. And another point we make is that the gladiators didn't really fight to the death like you see in Hollywood, because it was very expensive for these sports agents. They had gladiatorial teams to train and exercise and equip them. So they didn't want them killed off. And so the only ones that probably died were the condemned criminals. And so from the bustling streets, the markets of Pompeii, we then move into the private life, into a house. And so here are two frescoes of these palatial villas. Actually, they're sort of fantasy images, but they give you an idea of the luxury in some of the villas that surrounded Pompeii and some of the very luxurious homes in the city itself. And so how did they furnish their homes? And so here is a wonderful bronze lamp on your left, and you can see it consists of 4 hanging lamps, and then there's a statue of a little bronze statue of Dionysus or Bacchus riding a leopard. And then on your right is a wonderful marble table. Tables like this could have been in the garden, or they could have been inside the interior of the house where the homeowner, the master of the house, could display his wealth. Because the Romans at that time loved displaying their wealth, and especially their clients who would come into their homes. And how did they decorate the walls? The walls were decorated with frescoes. There's an example of the 3 Graces. And then they also stuccoed their walls. So here's a relief of an athlete. This is quite beautiful, and it's quite high. It's quite big, too, when you see it. And then if they were wealthy enough, they could afford mosaics to decorate their floors. And this is rather ironic that the mosaic shows a guard dog on your left, and then was found in the house of Orpheus. And then on your right is the guard dog that was actually found in the hallway that was guarding the house. The master must have left the dog chained to the entrance where these dogs were placed, and then the dog was finally perished by a pyroclastic flow that just froze him. And then you could see his legs are pulled back because of the heat, and after he died. Then there's a section on personal adornment focusing on women, and in the fresco you can see this young woman sitting on a very elegant little stool, and she's looking at a mirror and looking at her hair and tending to her hair and probably asking herself, what will my hairstyle be today? And then the 2 pieces of gold jewelry, there's a number of gold pieces, are these snake bracelet and the snake ring. These were styles that originated in Greece, and then they were picked up by the Romans, and this style was very popular throughout Italy during the 1st century AD. And then we now enter the kitchen, and so we find out what the Pompeians ate, how they cooked it, and how they served their food. And so there's a wonderful fish fresco showing the bounty of the Bay of Naples. And so there's fish hanging, there's sea bass, and then along the bottom, they're stacked with red mullet, which was a delicacy, very expensive too, in Pompeii. And then there's carbonized olives. These bowl of olives could have been sitting on a table just to be eaten, and then the eruption happened, and the heat of the eruption just carbonized them. And so if you were wealthy enough, you had a triclinium, which was a dining room with 3 couches. And here's a fresco showing a very elegant dining party or drinking party with a very wealthy woman lying on a very plush couch, and her male companion is drinking from a horn, a drinking horn, a rhyton. And then on the table in front, right here, this very elegant table, there's a silver set for wine drinking. And so these silver sets were very important for the wealthy. It was a way of displaying their wealth, and it was a way of storing wealth at the same time, like the family silver. We have a number of beautiful, exquisite silver vessels, and this is a cantharos decorated with ivy leaves in high relief. So you can see the very high relief. Some of the leaves are still retain some of their gilding. And the ivy leaves was a perfect decoration for the wine drinking cup because the ivy leaf was associated with the wine god Bacchus. And then we leave the interior of the house and then we go into the garden. The garden was the heart of the house. And the walls around the garden were sometimes painted with frescoes. And here's a fresco showing a garden. You can see the beautifully painted peacock. And then there's a sculpture in the middle, a relief sculpture showing a theater mask. And we have sculptures like this in the exhibition. And then if you were wealthy, you'd have your garden would be decorated with marble sculpture. And so there's a herm of Hercules. And then if you were wealthy enough again, you'd have water piped into your villa, into your house, and then you'd have fountains. And sometimes there were very elaborate fountains in the garden, and they were decorated with fountain sculpture. And here's a bronze sculpture of Silenus. He's a follower of Bacchus, and he's riding or seated on a pigskin that's really a vessel to carry wine. And at the front, you can see where his head would have been. That's where the jet of water would have come out that would have sprayed into the fountain. And then finally, here's the life-size bronze statue of a woman adjusting her peplos, or her garment. And her eyes are inlaid with bone, creating a very striking image. Bronze sculpture from antiquity is very rare because it was a perishable material, it could be melted. And there were 5 of these sculptures found in Herculaneum. And this is one of the ones that the Italians very generously loaned us. And so from the house, we go from the garden, we then go to the last time runs out for Pompeii. And so I'll just show you what Katherine was talking about before, how these casts are made. And so here's a figure, a person who has died from the intense heat. And so the ash from the pyroclastic flows adheres to his body and his clothing. And then the ash forms a hard shell as it cools off around his body. And then his inside, his tissue, human tissue, starts to decay and dissolve, and you're left with skeletal remains inside a perfect mold of the person who died. So here's the mold. And then in February of 1863, Fiorelli, the archaeologist, his work crew came to him and said, "We found these cavities in the ground, and there's skeletons in them, skeletal remains. What do we do?" So he had the idea of pouring liquid plaster inside these cavities. So here's an animation of an archaeologist pouring the liquid plaster inside. And so the plaster had to fill every crevice, and at the same time had to suspend and hold the skeletal remains. And so then after the plaster dried and hardened, they dug out the form, and then the ash that was still adhering to it was chipped off. And so here's the, you can see here, form that has been chipped off, body that's been chipped off, the ash has been chipped off. Then you end up with the casts. And so here's these mother and daughter. So it has been interpreted as the mother embracing her daughter for the last time. And it's from the Casa della Cryptoportica. And apparently when the eruption began, the Cryptoportica was basically a restaurant. They all ran down to the wine cellar. And then when the pumice started to alleviate a bit, probably just around midnight, they tried to escape, but they were caught in the garden by a pyroclastic flow. And then here's a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, and they were in the House of the Golden Bracelet. The House of the Golden Bracelet was a very fancy restaurant, and they tried to seek shelter under the stairway, under a stairway, but their escape was futile as the house was hit by a pyroclastic flow, and they were killed instantly. And as you can see, their so-called pugilist poses, the pose of a boxer, as they're called, because their tendons contracted and were pulled to their face. Well, on the other hand, sometimes the body's kept a natural form, like there's a little child in for here, and another child there, and then this is called the House of the Golden Bracelet because the mother, the wife, was wearing a very heavy, expensive golden bracelet, and so they call that the House of the Golden Bracelet. Well, when you go, we have 13 casts on display, and 5 of them were made using laser 3D technology printing, and the other 8 are the regular plasts made out of plaster through the old method. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition.
But please join me in thanking our speakers for these fantastic lectures. Thank you very much.